Welcome back, and don't forget to use hashtag Agroforestry if you are making comments or questions, and we can pick them up and put them to our speakers. And I'm delighted to introduce now Niels Corfield, who's going to speak on applied agroforestry design for Irish farmers for about half an hour or so, and then we're going to have again about 15 minutes of a question and answer sessions with him. And Niels is in the UK, and he's an advisor, researcher, educator, designer, grower and nurseryman, working to create regenerative landscapes, farms and operations in the UK and also across Europe. And he's focused on agroecological systems that are low maintenance and productive. Niels, it's a real pleasure to have you.
Well, hi. Shall I crack on?
That would be super. You go ahead, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end.
All right, thanks. Well, maybe I should do a screen share. So yeah, welcome everybody. Hopefully you're doing all right over there. Just sort of give us a blank wave if you can see me. So what we're going to cover today then basically, the topics for today's session basically will be like a little sort of whistle-stop design sequence. So what to do when, some design examples, a little bit on establishment, maintenance and harvesting, and then designing a field. So kind of agroforestry as a whole sits under the what I call the whole farm planning framework, which is a number of sort of like practical principles. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so basically the ones that pertain to trees are these ones here on the right hand side. So providing protection for stock, crops and structures, integrating trees for productive outputs, protecting riparian areas from stock and cropping. So the kind of key heading that I put to get this going basically is this idea, get them up, get them in basically, or get them in and get them up. So like initially for those sort of like year one plantings, the advice is to select fast growing, high biomass varieties or hybrids, and then sort of like we can infill with natives and to increase the diversity with subsequent plantings, enabling us to create that partially wooded landscape, which effectively is what we're looking to sort of generate in a nutshell, if you like, if it's extended to its sort of like conclusion, if you like. But fundamentally it's a movable feast, you know, just like a field here or there, for example, can still pay dividends basically. So we'll look at some design examples, and within that, like the sort of key elements to look at are patterns, different types of agroforestry. So is it a row pattern, for example, or is it alley cropping, silver pasture, etc.? And then when you really drill down into the details, like getting an idea of like what the total length of those rows would be, sizing your headlands or end rigs, for example, or head rigs. And then ideally at the end of that, we get a bill of materials basically, which we can use to take to the shop, if you like. So the first design example we'll look at is an upland grazing example from Scotland. So in this case, they are out wintering on a fairly sort of like exposed sort of open pasture basically, and they have open water that sort of bisects the fields. They have burns running down between the fields. So this one is to illustrate primarily sort of number 9 on the whole farm planning principles. So provide protection for stock in this case, provide shelter from wind, driving rain and drifting snow, and otherwise potentially some shade in the season. So initially we'd want to do sort of a bit of a climate analysis, identify where the winds are coming from, both the prevailing winds and the winter winds. So those are indicated here basically, so prevailing winds basically blowing along the valley, and that is sort of like a canyoning effect, which can often sort of like adjust the wind direction from the prevailing wind, the overall prevailing wind. So that's something that you will know fairly well from your operation basically. But in this instance, we're basically trying to put in sort of tree belts that are contiguous and more or less at 90 degrees to that prevailing wind direction, which we're sort of achieving here and here basically. We then want to sort of like have a mind to where these openings are, for example, to minimize the amount of sort of funneling that will occur between these spaces. And if you look at this particular example, we can see that like it's really only winds that are blowing in a very particular direction that will be able to sort of find their way through. Then also what we have is got riparian buffer strips. So basically these can either just be fenced out areas or they can be planted areas, and they run along those watercourses, along the burns. And then in this instance, because they're out wintering, yeah, so there's an indication for like conifers to help the stock in those periods. And here's just a bit of data to show, yeah, sort of performance of sheep in this case, and live weight in sheltered versus unsheltered examples. And yeah, consistently the sheltered stock outperform the unsheltered, or we could say those that have access to the stock. So again, the silver pasture might look something like this. I mean, it could be grid planted or something more sensitive, but obviously the consideration around maintenance means that, you know, grid layouts are fairly common, basically. So now let's look at sort of how we might put together a design for like a field, for example. Normally work sort of field by field as well as sort of whole farm discreetly. So the sequence of work through is start at the boundaries, then work into the headlands, and then look at the interior, and then start looking at species mixes. So this is another example, another upland pasture example. In this case, an exposed coastal location with elevation and a sort of gentle sort of southerly slope, basically. So it's permanent pasture, quite a large space. So we'll just do a little bit of a site overview now on Google Earth. So I'll just kind of zoom in so you can just get a feel for the general location of this particular field. So we can see we're sort of overlooking the sea here, kind of sloping down to the sea. And otherwise, it's sort of a gentle slope, but a kind of upland pasture, sort of more or less sort of like at a hilltop, basically. So we've got sort of winds coming in from sort of east and west in this case. So let's just sort of mark on kind of key wind directions to sort of indicate that. So we're definitely going to be having sort of winter easterlies and northeasterlies, for example, coming in, and then sort of westerlies and southwesterlies during the season, basically. So obviously we want to provide protection from both of those types of winds, if you like. But in this instance, we've obviously got a nicely established sort of woodland here to the north, so we're not sort of worried about that. So that boundary can sort of stay open, in inverted commas. Then in this instance, because we're trying to provide protection from winter winds, we need something that will give us cover. So we need some evergreen plantings, and ideally something that has a nice sort of dense planting to the base and doesn't hollow out lower down like a deciduous tree would tend to do. And in this instance, we're also looking at sort of having some additional sort of willow plantings that can be used as a bit of a nurse crop, help the coniferous windbreak to get established, and then we can start putting those into a short rotation coppice. Also sort of experimenting here with this idea of interplanting ivy as a way to give, again, more winter cover. So probably would put that on this side as well, potentially, depending on how it's going to be managed. And the same on this side. So again, typically put the sort of permanent, slower growing coniferous species on the outside, basically in a sort of no maintenance location, in inverted commas. And then on the inside, that's the area that basically, or those rows we can then sort of maintain, basically. And then the thing to say here is we've put in our end rigs. headrigs and headlands, and that incorporates that additional sort of width from those other boundary plantings. So then probably phase one would look to do some kind of like intermediate plantings. So again, this would be looking at basically subdivisions effectively. So we've got the same sort of headland width around the top, and then just like so bisecting the field into sort of 4 equal portions, sort of roughly. So these 3 should be equal. And then we could then look forward, or going forward, then we can sort of infill, and in this case with some sort of mixed row planted species. So in this case, we're all kind of like, they're all trying to optimize for browse production and diversity of browse, for example. So the hybrid subdivisions, they're about pioneering browse, shelter and shade, can be coppiced after 5 years, potentially interplant with ivy. Then mixed native broadleaves, sort of late succession, high nutrient browse, also potential to be coppiced. And then also native willows and poplars. In this case, we're trying to match the vigor of the different species so they can be interplanted fairly successfully without sort of one shading out the other, basically. So one thing to say about this is actually in this instance, the orientation is kind of like suboptimal, I would say. The sort of closer to north-south, north is up here. The closest to north-south we can get, the better really to optimize the solar gain, if you like, when it is sunny. So in this instance, I probably would use this boundary here as the one to be parallel with. So we'd end up with a pattern that was a little bit more towards the south, if you like. So that's a kind of a minor sort of like adjustment that can be made to this pattern. And it's these types of gleanings that really only show themselves when you do kind of like outline pattern designs, basically. So the more that you do sort of little sample designs, test designs, the more you can glean about the sort of like the strengths and weaknesses of your particular idea, basically. So this is when we can look at a couple of other examples. So on a large field, in this case, sort of on a very free draining soil, so on Cotswold Brash, this is a arable reversion site. And these are kind of like worked examples. So this is a 24-meter alley example, and this is that kind of phase one planting. So year one, sort of like initial kind of backbone plantings, and then some kind of shelter belt, for example, again, sort of an L shape, so a contiguous shape. And then when the planting is complete, you know, something like sort of biomass or then productive alternately space in alternate rows, basically. So the stock will have nearly universal access to browse or shelter, and these fast-growing trees can help to shelter slow-growing trees, basically, help them to get away. Can just look at a different example here. So that should say 36 at the top, not 32, so 36-meter alleys. So just a kind of comparison with the example we just looked at. And yeah, just to say that, like, you know, at the end of this, we should be able to produce something that gives us like a bill of materials. So we identified, or I didn't, in this case, identifying particular varieties or species that will be suitable for this location. In this case, we've gotten for ones that are in leaf late. I should say that there, actually. Good for difficult conditions, upland, drought tolerant, or have a high calorific value, although we're not so concerned about that one, and having good browse. So in this case, these particular varieties, not necessarily adapted for the Irish example, although there are tables which have been kindly referred to from Crops for Energy. But yeah, in this case, we'd look to identify specific varieties that do well in your environment, basically. And that's one of the advantages of the hybrid willows. Actually, there is quite extensive tests, research that we can refer to. So there's tests carried out in Orkney, tests carried out in Wales, and I think also in Ireland, basically. So we've got that information to refer to. So at the end of this, we should basically produce a kind of bill of materials, and that is based on kind of like the individual row lengths. Yeah, so getting a calculation from that, and then getting a total basically from those. So in this case, we're comparing the 24 against the 36, and the kind of like the main take home here is that like we've got a significant amount more trees in the 24-meter alley example. So in this instance, these are the phase 1 plantings here in green. So we've got a separate bill of materials for that one basically. And then obviously we can generate a price from that, which is also really useful. Okay, so we'll look at another example now, another upland example. This one's also from Scotland. In this instance, you know, it's really about sort of a diversification planting, and also working sort of like in tandem, or working sort of to complement new development basically as like a small eco-settlement, you could say. So it's quite a sort of diversified planting. This is the new, what's it called, sort of eco-village here on the right. So we're looking to provide protection around that, putting in riparian buffers around the burns that run through it, putting in kind of edible landscape around the houses themselves. But the main thing that's useful here, basically, again, we've got windbreaks here to protect from those prevailing winds. We're using a sort of dispersed planting on the sort of flat, lower lying fields. So what you might call sort of wide-spaced agroforestry or parkland, so clumps of trees, basically, ideally that mast producing, so suitable for pannage or other sort of like finishing of monogastrics. Then again, the sort of more sort of like biomass coppice on the slopes, so on a parallel pattern, sort of following the slope, and then again where it sort of like flattens out on the hilltop, we've got that same sort of open pattern basically. And in this instance here, we're also using sort of like a combination of conifers and fast-growing hybrids to provide shelter around basically a sort of wood chip yard. In this case, it's an old quarry, so we'll use that as a sort of living barn basically, or an outdoor feeding area. Just to kind of point to these kind of riparian management systems or riparian buffers, you know, there's a number of ways to cut it basically, but fundamentally we're trying to restrict access from the riverbank from stock basically. And that can be as simple as just throwing up a fence, or even having temporary fencing, or obviously you can go further than that and do plantings as well. Okay, so now I want to come on to a worked example, or another worked example, and perhaps look at this in a little bit more detail. So this is a mixed arable operation, 4 years of grazing, 4 years of lay, here in this main section here. And that's why we're putting in sort of coppice alley cropping, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. And then we've also done some stuff here, sort of undergrazing, so incorporating chicken tractors, for example, under their heritage orchard. So we're going to look at then sort of the management of this system, basically. So again, sort of it's a coppice alley cropping system in this instance. So it's both for browse and for biomass. And in this case, we're looking to use the biomass for compost making, sort of like creating sort of high quality fungally dominated compost. And oops, just come out of there. And one of the reasons why we're coppicing this, the rows basically, is to avoid them being browsed up. Yeah, because obviously over the years, a browse line would normally be kind of like formed in any kind of like contiguous row or a hedge, for example. So in this instance, we'll basically sort of keep them stock-proofed with sort of 2-wire temporary electric fencing. And then sort of towards the end of the season, for example, we can either allow them sort of access to the whole stool for grazing, or we can be coppicing and then sort of leaving. So it can kind of be a sort of like chop and drop type feed. But anyway, we'll enable the stock then to have access to the majority of the leaf material, and we can then process the wood at a later date, and then obviously sort of protect that and reset it. And again, the ivy thing is like sort of shown here. It's definitely sort of like highly preferential browse. So we're looking to kind of incorporate some of that in there as well. So yeah, here's just to show the kind of like how, you know, without the coppice, it would basically be browsed up. So in terms of like sort of managing the system, again, looking to use, well, actually in this instance, wood chip mulch and the temporary electric fencing. Although we're also considering round bales. But the thing I want to look at in more detail whilst we're here is just an analysis of these different row orientations that have been put forward. And this is one of the sort of fundamental things to look at when sort of identifying the sort of efficacy of a particular design proposal fundamentally. So pattern 1 is sort of the kind of default in this instance, and that's basically because they've got an 8-year rotation, and that's divided across these 2 fields. So there's 4 years in any one field, basically. So we've already got these 4 different kind of like treatments in each of these fields, and they're already in this shape. So that's why pattern 1 basically scores highly for efficiency, space efficiency, for example. It fits the existing shape, and we have nice regularly sized alleys. They're all the same length and width, obviously, so that's really good. But the orientation, not so good, basically. In this instance, obviously the easterly winds risk basically funneling up the alleys, and the westerly winds also to a degree as well. Obviously we can put in sort of shelter belts along the top, and we have made some provision for that, like along here, just to sort of mitigate that, for example. But otherwise, yeah, sort of winds coming in from here may well just basically funnel up those alleys. So we can end up actually increasing the wind speeds. So if we look at number 2, then we go with a true north-south orientation, and that obviously optimizes solar gain and also minimizes any funneling from kind of winds coming in from sort of east or west, basically. However, we end up with very irregularly sized alleys. You know, each one where it's got a sort of wedge, they're kind of trapezoid shaped, and they're all different lengths. If it was just a single crop in there at once, it probably wouldn't be too much of an issue. You know, if it was just one arable crop at once, then in this instance, it probably would be fine, basically. But for now, that's certainly a concern, basically. So if we look at the third one, then we're going sort of like width-wise in this case, basically. So we're ending up with an orientation that's basically sort of west-southwest, for example. And that, again, scores highly for the regular alley widths, row widths, for example, and the lengths, and sort of fits with the field, basically. But yeah, we've definitely got sort of like serious funneling risks from that southwest. But obviously, again, that can be sort of like mitigated with additional sort of shelter belts or windbreaks, for example. But the main thing that we haven't discussed about sort of 1 or 3 is the orientation with regards to solar access. So if we like think about, you know, where the sun goes around like this, doesn't it, basically? So it's at its zenith midday. So in this case, where we've got the sort of the westerly orientation, we're not going to end up getting any sun until sort of like mid-afternoon, basically early afternoon, and it won't basically be in sun for the rest of the day. So if you can't achieve, or rather, if you can't achieve like a north-south orientation, or if the north-south orientation doesn't really fit, with the context, if you like, then having an east aspect is always preferred, basically, because that means we're going to get the sun sort of early morning and keep it till sort of like mid-morning, for example. So that means we get some warmth into the alleys that can then sort of carry us through to the end of the day. Whereas the west will kind of stay cool or cold, if you like, until the end of the afternoon, in which case it's sort of a bit sort of like missing the boat, if you like. Okay, so that's the analysis on the orientation. In this case, there isn't really sort of a clear winner, except that probably P1 is what we'll go with, and just sort of like deal with the issues. So the final thing then to say is, I want to sort of like copy all of that material, ideally sort of handle that sort of using some kind of machinery, for example, circular saws, tree shears, that kind of thing. Polewood can go to the market garden, which is on site, so there's definitely a demand for that. This is a fairly kind of diversified operation. And wood chip can go to compost. Again, sort of willow, for example, produces like, pretty much the highest grade compost that you can make. So the more of that you can produce, the better, pretty much. But then there's also an opportunity to put a degree of the material through a wood fuel process, basically, and probably use the branch logger to do that. So this is basically processing kind of small diameter polewood, so up to sort of 3 inches or so, into little billets that are between 4 and 6 inches long, and that is nicely sort of like served up into a small mesh bag, which are very easy to handle and can be seasoned in a stack quite neatly, or these larger sort of dump bags, for example, and then that can then be upcycled into biochar, for example. Ideally, using the wood burners that are already in the venue, basically, so we're capturing the heat by heating the space, and then also recovering a degree of that material through pyrolysis. And that sort of biochar we can use as an amendment for composting, for example, or to go into the market garden. So yeah, there's a number of kind of like outputs potentially from this, basically. So that's more or less what I wanted to cover here, except to just sort of like give a little bit of specifics on the different species mixes, and say that, and again, in this instance, the primary objective is to kind of match the vigor of the relative vigor of the different species. So we don't have one that just basically totally overshadows the other and like means the other species doesn't establish. So again, the hybrid willows and poplars go together well, and the native willows and poplars go together well. And you could also include aspen in there, obviously, as well, and potentially sweet chestnut. And obviously that has a high value material, basically. The wood is a high energy density. And then amongst the native broadleaves, for example, hazel, sycamore, rowan, wych elm, field maple, birch, potentially also white beam. They all grow fairly uniform speed-wise, so they can be planted in sort of clumps of 3 or 4, for example, in the row. And then looking at sort of productive hazelnuts and chestnuts, there's another potential mixture, for example. Okay, so that's more or less what I wanted to speak about with that particular layout. Otherwise, there's a couple of other examples where we can like take some small gleanings. So, for example, again, we can use strategically placed tree species to give shelter to kind of key structures. In this case, this is a roundhouse on top of a hill, basically, with very exposed conditions. So trying to create this contiguous or L shape, even though that will create quite a bit of shelter, or rather shade, from the south. And then final other examples we can look at are some design kind of incorporating a few different layouts, for example. So key line alley cropping here to the sort of west, northeast, biomass alley-cropping down to the south, and the silver pasture here in the centre, and then incorporating tree nursery, wet system, and living barn here in the north as well, and the tree nursery obviously in this instance being close to the road, and the wet system being next to the living barn, so it can deal with any sort of dirty water or any other sort of like effluent that might wash down, basically. So the final one then is just a couple of key line patterns to show how we can kind of create sort of off-contour parallel patterns that could deal with sort of runoff issues. If there's something that you're facing, runoff or flooding issues, the key line pattern definitely deals with that in year one. And this is a more detailed layout. So again, we're trying to sort of like deal with surface water and turn it from a problem into an asset, basically. Okay, so I want to sort of leave that there and now invite questions.
Very interesting. We've had quite a few questions come in, and we'll just go straight to them. What Malin Gardens, what trees would you advise for rocky land on a windy coastal plot?
Okay, so when he's saying plot, I'm assuming garden, so something fairly like small scale. So the rocky bit, I guess that is a concern, that stuff is like potentially pre-draining. But certainly my experience on brashy soils is actually pretty much any species does well, actually. So I think the free draining may actually open up options in terms of species selection rather than sort of close them down, if you like. But obviously sort of like doing the due diligence around establishment and making sure that, you know, if it's very dry for the first couple of years, then you might be prepared to do some watering. So exposed examples, again, if it's a shelter belt that we're looking for, we want to sort of like go through that hierarchy. So, you know, what winds are we trying to protect from? Is it winter winds? Is it summer winds, for example? If it's winter winds, then obviously we've got many fewer options than if it's just sort of like prevailing winds, for example. You know, if it's prevailing winds, then we've got like a whole host of like the deciduous species to choose from, and always the deciduous will outgrow the conifers. They're always like the fastest growing, basically. But in terms of sort of like species that are sort of maritime adapted, the alders seem to do fine, basically. In fact, often can thrive. Willows, and there's certainly like particular hybrids that have been assessed in maritime examples. And then obviously things like sea buckthorn as well might be considered.
Super, thank you. Jack says, thank you very much, Niels. Will wind funneling occur with straight alleys about 700 metres long, even if shelter belts are planted at the ends?
Yeah, well, basically it depends on what those shelter belts are. Shelter belts normally sort of give effective shelter up to about 10 times the height. Yeah, more or less, something like that. So if you've got a 10-metre tall shelter belt and it's fairly dense, that will give you sort of 100 metres of good wind breaking. You'll still feel it up to 20 times the height, but like it will start to tail off from that point, basically. So the main thing is like your shelter belt is a point source, so it's a kind of localised feature. I mean, obviously, kind of like shelter belts can grow to sort of 20 and 30 metres tall, but that will take, you know, 20, 30 years, for example, even for a very fast growing one. Willows and that kind of thing probably would top out at about 15 metres, for example, but get there much quicker. So yeah, probably need to look at the pattern that you're looking at, but it's certainly still a risk, basically.
Okay, super. Sean, you've got a question.
Yeah, I've a couple of questions, Niels. One thing I noticed, your presentation and some of the other ones, I think Clive's and John's, both presentations, you can actually get into quite complex systems if you're trying to follow topology or farm layouts and stuff like that. Is there software out there that would help farmers maybe to develop their own system, or have you come across anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. There is a new piece of software out there now, and I think it's called RegenWorks or RegenWorks. It's a fairly new bit of software being developed by a Danish developer, sort of a bit of a one-man band, but it is, absolutely designed for agroforestry design, and it's very thorough, basically. It does
would you recommend that as an approach, Niels?
Yes, actually. I mean, it's the only thing that does what it does. I mean, it's a bit clunky, to be honest, but it really is the only thing that does what that does. So, if you want an orientation that's slightly off angle, you want to put it in a polygon that's, an odd-shaped field, for example, it automatically kind of like chops the length of the line to fit in that. You can change the headland sizes, for example. It does all the things that I've kind of shown manually, but automatically. So nothing else does what that does, basically. But there's a bit of a learning curve. So, as with all of these things.
We have another question from Cork. Could you explain what you mean by using round bales?
Yeah, so just basically rolling out round bales and use them as a mulch. So kind of like maybe one roll on one side of the row and one roll on the other side of the row. It's not something we've experimented with extensively. It does seem like wood chip potentially applied with a feed wagon is the optimum, but obviously all of these things have a cost associated with them. So it's kind of like use what you've got, basically. So if you can get your hands on some spoiled silage or some spoiled hay, for example, then just rolling that out. But in that situation, again, voles with all mulches is a concern, basically. So you do need to monitor for voles and deer, obviously, in sort of year 1, year 2, that kind of time.
Yeah. We don't have a problem with voles, but deer we do.
Definitely.
So, there's another anonymous question here. Any advice for established tree rows, species and maintenance plans in flat river frontage pastures that flood several times a year?
Can you just repeat the question, please?
Just this person's looking for advice on what they would plant in flat pastures that flood a couple times a year.
Yep, okay. Well, certainly any of the riparian species would be good to go. So any of the alders, willows, poplars, for example. So in terms of doing your kind of your species searches, anything that sort of grows in an upland situation would often be indicated. Got sort of wet, boggy environments, so aspens would work there, for example. And then it's really just about sort of what the output that they want is. So is it just sort of shelter browse and sort of copies, for example, biomass, in which case then, you can go for more sort of fast growing stuff, or is it productive, sort of fruit trees and that kind of thing. In that case, it's more about selecting root stocks that are suitable for potentially waterlogged ground. And I think probably the main thing to be aware of, I'm assuming it's mostly sort of winter inundation that is when these times occur. And that then you do really need to have something that can tolerate sort of extended wet periods. But certainly the alders and willows and the poplars, you're safe with those, basically.
And when it comes to fruit, what would you suggest?
Well, it's really about the root stock, to be honest, actually. So you want probably a vigorous root stock. So on apples, it'd be MM111. That's probably the go-to for a root stock that's tolerant of waterlogging, basically. And what's interesting, or what you might be able to do, is do an interstock with them. So you actually sort of double work it with a dwarfing rootstock between that and the actual fruiting portion of the tree, and that will enable you to bring the fruiting forward by a number of years and to control the size of the tree, because otherwise a vigorous rootstock will produce a fairly large tree, basically. That tends to be non-commercial, basically.
So, sorry, that's interesting there. Now, so what are you saying is that you'd maybe have an M11 rootstock,
Yep.
but grafted onto a smaller plant. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so you basically sort of, rather than just grafting it once with the fruiting, you graft another rootstock, just a branch of the rootstock, and you have a little mini interstock of like maybe 6 inches or so, and then you graft again onto that, the fruiting proportion.
Oh, that's really interesting. I've never heard of that now, to be honest.
Niels, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much. How can people stay in touch with you? Are you on social media? Do you?
Yes. Niels_Corfield on Twitter, or nielscorfield.com is my website.
Fantastic. Niels, thank you so much, and thank you for answering all those questions so well as well.
Thanks again, Niels.
So we'll be back at 6:45, so in 5 minutes, with Imogen Rabone, who's going to talk about agroforestry, an ancient concept, reinstating farm tree cover. So be back in about 5 minutes.